I'm Dave Hammer, the Executive Director of the ICA Group. And ICA right now, so we're a Massachusetts-based nonprofit. We work nationally. But right now, we have the privilege of having a contract in the state of Massachusetts to help administer the Massachusetts Center for Employee Ownership. We're particularly excited about this report and this data that we're going to be sharing today. It's been a number of years since Massachusetts has done a census of employee-owned companies. The last time it was done was in 2006, at the time when the Massachusetts office was administered by Ownership Associates, a Cambridge-based organization that works with employee-owned companies, and ICA Group. And in 2008, the funding during the Great Recession, funding for the Mass office was lost. So the last time this census was done in any meaningful way was 2006. And for the last couple of years, as we've been sort of getting the office back and running, up and running, we've been really, really focused on building relationships with existing employee-owned companies, but also really just trying to help and engage with business owners who are looking at exit and looking at succession to help them kind of make sure they have a plan in place for that. So we were really thrilled this year to be able to put some real energy into this analysis and this report to sort of share, like, what is the state of the sector in Massachusetts. I think it would be unfair of us not to thank the other groups that whose other kind of analysis we leverage for some of the thinking around this, which is the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the ESOP Association, and the National Center for Employee Ownership, all places that are really just doing some fantastic, amazing work in terms of understanding employee ownership nationally. And so I think our work here is really building upon a lot of the foundational work that they have done. So I want to thank them for their work. So to give a sense around, how we approach this, what we essentially did was we looked at publicly available data. We looked at trade association data, and we conducted our own sort of original initial research to really try to identify, like, who are the employee-owned companies in Massachusetts, with a particular focus on ESOPs and worker cooperatives, because those are the vast, vast majority of broad-based employee-owned companies. There are some other models out there, and some of those are included in the data, but for the most part, we're focusing on ESOPs and cooperatives, and that's where this analysis is really going to be centered. So broad level piece around this. There are 168 employee-owned companies in Massachusetts. You may have heard us say a number that's different than that in the past. And that was because we were operating off of data that hadn't been had the same level of robust analysis. This is a number that we feel very, very strongly about, that we're sort of right, or, that this is, like, as of right now, that this is the right number. 66% of those, 2/3, are ESOPs. 1/3 of those are worker cooperatives, right? So it's a real mix. We're going to talk about worker co-ops and ESOPs in different ways, because they are different types of businesses. They are, as Siobhan mentioned earlier, ESOPs tend to be larger, co-ops tend to be smaller. There is some overlap, but there is some interesting, I think it's worthwhile to note sort of some of the differences. The key thing that I think we want to stress here, though, is that they are just different models for employee ownership that fit the different needs of that business. So an ESOP isn't right for everybody, a worker co-op isn't right for everybody, but together they are there. The total number of employee owners, or people who work for employee-owned companies in Massachusetts, is over 19,000. And the total revenue, which is not just data, not just revenue from activity in Massachusetts, but nationally, is $133.9 billion in revenue. So a big, contributor to, a significant piece of this work. Just going to give a warning that there's a lot of data here. We've got 20 minutes. I'm going to go, through it pretty quickly. We're going to be putting out a version of this. Both this recording is going to be available for folks. We're also putting out this report So if there's something you're like, hey, I want to catch in on this, we can do a question Q&A around it later. But all that stuff is going to be available for folks in the future. So where are employee-owned companies, right? They are all over the Commonwealth. So you can see, this a map that they are all over the state of Massachusetts, obviously with a concentration in the metropolitan Boston area and Boston. But that is the key center. What we did was also wanted to look at the sort of headquarter locations for employee-owned companies in low-income zip codes. So we did an analysis of there, and we found that 28% of all employee-owned companies have their headquarters in low-income zip codes, and that's 18% of ESOPs and 46% of worker cooperatives. So one of the things that we think is exciting about this is it really does represent that, and this is a lower percentage of businesses overall, but it really does sort of represent that, like, employee-owned companies are really focused in on, addressing some really significant and important community economic development pieces. For folks who are familiar with Massachusetts, gateway cities are sort of cities that are, we're really from an economic development perspective, we're really focused in on. 20% of ESOPs are located in gateway cities, and 26% of worker cooperatives are located in gateway cities. When you look at size, right? And here I want to stress something. In this analysis, we're really focusing in on privately held, private employee-owned companies. So Raytheon is a Massachusetts-based company for now, but it's a Massachusetts-based company that has an ESOP. It is a publicly traded company, however, so the ESOP represents a pretty small percentage of the employees on a small percentage of the company. In this analysis, we exclude all publicly traded companies. And the reason is because they tend to be significantly larger. And so, and there's only a few of them, but because there's only 8 or 9 of them in Massachusetts, but because they're so large, they tend to skew things. So here we're excluding those folks from that analysis, but it gives you a sense of kind of the typical, what we think is sort of more typical employee-owned companies. So they range between 3 employees and 2,000 employees. The average EO company has 185. For ESOPs, that number is 281 is the average, and for worker co-ops, 13 is the average. So when we talk about these things are different, ESOPs being kind of a better fit, strong fit for larger companies, co-ops being a better fit for smaller companies. This is the this is sort of represents that. That being said, in that great middle of between like 30 and 75 employees, there's a lot of overlap. So that's one of the things that we want to stress is that there's tendencies for big and small, but there's a lot of significant overlap. And you can sort of see that by here. So in this is looking at sort of the distribution of employment size by ESOPs and cooperatives. And so you can see the biggest chunk of companies are in this 20 to 50 or 20 to 49 employment size. That's 26%, a quarter of businesses are in that size. I think it's worth noting that there's an enormous amount of energy dedicated towards, and this is well spent energy. This is not a critique, it's just an observation. There's an enormous amount of energy dedicated towards very small business development. And there's an enormous amount of energy dedicated towards very large business development. The place where there is almost the biggest lacking piece is small businesses, medium-sized businesses. That's where employee ownership sits. And it's such a great fit for those companies. So when we talk about we need to put energy into employee ownership, we're actually talking about you need to put energy into supporting Main Street businesses. which is why we think this is such an important area for expanded work in this. And this I think slide captures that. You can look at ESOPs. There's 10,221 employees employed in these Massachusetts companies, 666 employees in the worker cooperatives. You can sort of see the breakdown here of by the different size, but it gives you a sense that you're really looking at some small companies and some large companies, but obviously worker cooperatives tend to be smaller, ESOPs tend to be larger. We look at revenues. Combined revenue, the average is overall is $40 million. But once again, I think it's an important distinction. For ESOPs, that's $54 million. For worker cooperatives, it's $2.9 million. These are different kind of companies. They address different kind of things. They have different kind of needs. They have a lot of similar needs around employee ownership culture in terms of building understand how to support and how to address employee ownership. But just to give a sense of this is that this is kind of where these companies where these companies are at. I think it's critical for us to remember, though, in this is that when we talk about, like as I talked about earlier, the economic development space, the small business development space, it's really focused on startups, and then it's focused on really large businesses. The folks who are $50 million in revenue, the folks who are $3 million in revenue, there's really a market gap or a market failure or a system failure to really provide the kind of support for these folks. The employee ownership ecosystem is one that does that. And so we think it's really one that the state would benefit from putting more energy into. So that's we're really thrilled that the state has put so much energy into supporting that CEO, because it really is when we talk about supporting employee ownership, what we're talking about is supporting these kind of businesses that are really missing from the great piece. So just have a few more minutes on this. So at this stage, I'm going to start going pretty quick through this. But we look at employee ownership. What percentage of companies are majority employee owned? So overall, in Massachusetts, 53% of companies are majority owned by their employees. Amongst ESOPs, that's a third. But it's almost there's a lot of stuff where it's not noted, right? So we don't know the answer to that question for everybody. Generally speaking, ESOPs tend to either be significantly below 30% or at 30% or 50% or 100%. That tends to be where they fall. Obviously, there are exceptions to that rule, but 30% is where kind of a lot of the tax benefits and key things kick in. And that's a significant piece of ownership there. Worker cooperatives, by their structure, are 100% employee owned. So that is that. Another key thing that I think is important for us to take away here is this looking at how old the business is. And what you can sort of see here is that worker co-ops are young. They were formed between 2010 and 2019, and ESOPs are old. 51% of companies, employee-owned companies in Massachusetts, were formed before 1989. So when we talk about saving these kind of companies, Senator Lesser was talking about precision manufacturing and things of that nature in Massachusetts. We looked at the specifically a number of years ago, we looked at the machine shop sector in Massachusetts. There was one company in the machine shop sector that was formed after 1989 in Massachusetts. These are really critical jobs. These are really critical businesses. ESOPs and co-ops are a mechanism for those companies to stay around. And without an ESOP or without a co-op, those businesses disappear. And when you replace those jobs, you're not replacing that sort of skilled manufacturing job with another skilled manufacturing job. You're oftentimes replacing it with a low-wage, precarious service sector job. And yes, we need to work to improve service sector jobs, but we shouldn't do that at the expense of throwing away high, good quality jobs. So ESOPs tend to be old. We got to save these companies, and we got to make sure that we're keeping them there, which is I think is important and interesting. This is the breakdown, and we're not going to be able to get into the details here, but this is a breakdown of employee-owned companies by industry compared to all companies in Massachusetts. I think there's some sort of key takeaways here that are interesting. One is that professional, scientific, and technical and manufacturing businesses are far more, there's a much higher percentage of those folks in those industries in Massachusetts, for employee-owned companies in Massachusetts, right? So 24% of EO companies are in the manufacturing sector compared to only 3%, statewide. Some of the 27% compared to 12% in terms of professional, scientific, and technical. So these are industries that provide a lot of really solid, important middle skill and good quality jobs. Our idea is that really we can really, this is employee ownership is a great fit for this. The flip side of this, though, is you look at like a place like construction here that, it's only 4% of employee-owned companies are in construction and sort of underrepresented. However, if you look at employee ownership in the construction space, it's a fantastic fit. Folks may be familiar with South Mountain Company, a design build firm in Martha's Vineyard. And then there's a company that just recently converted to employee ownership called Big Meister in Newton. These are companies that are, in the construction space that really have embraced the idea of employee ownership, and it uses it to really, make these jobs fantastic. So there's both like an opportunity here for us to say, hey, how do we focus on employee ownership in this space so we can keep these businesses here, right? Looking at, specifically here, looking at healthcare and social assistance, a hugely important sector in the state of Massachusetts, way underrepresented in employee ownership. And yes, maybe those businesses don't lead because they're kind of tied to a local population, but they don't necessarily create the asset accumulation, especially for frontline workers, that they could if they were employee owned. So this is just a real, I think it's sort of a blueprint for some of the work we're going to be trying to do in the coming years about how we can make a change to, within some certain industries to really shape how we're thinking about the future of this. We did it's part of this work, we did a survey of kind of a detailed survey of worker cooperatives. We hope to expand this to the ESOP community in the next year. But this just gives sort of I think a pretty interesting breakdown of sort of where co-ops are, is that you look at 58% of co-ops have a majority woman or non-binary workforce. 40% of worker cooperatives have a majority BIPOC workforce. There's a lot of talk about conversions, which is the idea of transitioning from an existing, conventionally or a singly owned or partner-owned company to employee ownership. 64% of worker co-ops in Massachusetts were part of a transition. And on average, 65% of these folks are worker owners. Most times in worker cooperatives, you don't need to be a worker owner or an employee owner to be part of it. There's a lot of data here. We don't have enough time to get into the details because we're just a couple minutes. But I think one of the key things here is that there's some real advantages. Kind of the key takeaway is that when worker cooperatives are asked, like they really sort of stress that the cooperative, the employee ownership component of this is a real shift in terms of giving them advantages in business and in terms of having them be resilient under COVID. And we've got some folks from the ESOP Association here. There's an enormous amount of data on the national level that sort of affirms this same exact thing for ESOPs nationally, which is going to be applicable to Massachusetts. So this is just, I think, a really important takeaway that employee ownership, builds resiliency. Once again, we don't have a whole lot of time to get into this, but this will be in this report. we looked at sort of some of the key challenges and supports that folks need. This just gives us a sense of where the kind of things that people are really looking for business technical assistance or on navigating growth, thinking about training and professional development, and obviously given the Great Resignation, the whole issue around recruitment. I'm going to skip here just for time. When we look at ESOPs, this is, this one of the great things about ESOPs is because they are, we have some really solid data, or really fantastic data around the retirement piece. On average, in Massachusetts, the average annual contribution that the ESOP made to people was $14,000. That was how much sort of assets were contributed to people. I think it's really important to stress ESOP companies tend to also have 401ks. So this is on top of any 401k contribution or any 401k match or any defined benefit plan, right? So the shift here is we're talking about the ESOP making a really significant contribution to folks. Similarly, when you look at average, the total account balance for participants is $135,000. Now, in a lot of places, once again, stress, this is not the entire retirement savings. This is just one of the legs, the stool of the retirement savings. This puts people at a significant advantage over non-employee ownership, non-employee owners. And the reality is because ESOP companies are more productive, because ESOP companies are more profitable, what they tend to do is they tend to have a faster growth rate than their competitors. So this is a number that's going up. And because they tend to lay people off, even if we have an economic recession, even if we have an economic downturn in some way, it's not that these folks are getting kicked to the curb. They're being kept, retained into this business. And then on average, the typical the plan assets, the ESOP, and this once again is just for private companies. On average, ESOP owners, workers at ESOP companies, the assets they worth around $25 million shared amongst those employees. So that's not the value of the company. That's the assets that are owned by those workers. So I think a really powerful testament to the kind of asset building and wealth building that employee ownership can hold. And in a place like Massachusetts, where the cost of living is so exorbitant and expensive, for folks in companies like manufacturing or folks who are in companies, like some of these professional service companies, the ESOP can be the difference between, their how they maintain their future and their lives. Just one other kind of key thing as we talk about kind of policy issues and challenges, 61% of ESOPs are using debt to establish the ESOP. This is a common practice. It's called a leveraged ESOP. It's one of the things that we've talked a lot about from a sort of a policy perspective of things needed is how, in order to encourage more employee ownership, how do we create more mechanisms to support the sort of the debt to help that transition. So this is a real thing that's needed and necessary. So from a public policy standpoint, we just wanted to call it out. So that is, I only went 2 minutes over. Apologies for that. I really appreciate that. We're going to be putting out, as I said, the full report on this in the coming week.